Yeah, and that is the trailer for The Damned United, 2009. That film came out. Historically, not exactly the most accurate film, but it was adapted from a historically inaccurate book as well. But it is a great film nonetheless. And to discuss that, Colm Boohig, Ciaran Bradley and Paul Moore, a forfer, I think is what they call this. How are you getting on, lads?
Good, man, yeah, very well.
Too bad.
So, from the get-go, we have to say that this film just is not in any way historically accurate at all. Like, it does not represent the people involved. There are several people who are portrayed in this film, and the book as well have won damages because of how inaccurate this was and how they were portrayed in the film. So, from the get-go, that has to be said. But Michael Sheen, Colm Meaney, the entire cast and the film, as a football film on its own, it's a brilliant watch.
It is, yeah. It's like the portrayal of Clough by Sheen is obviously such a phenomenal achievement of character acting. Like, he's got the mannerisms and the accent down to an absolute T.
Initial thoughts on this film, Paul?
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make, in that we are looking at a movie here which has to distance itself from a novel, which has to distance itself from the truth. If you look strictly at the novel, I know the Clough family were unhappy at the portrayal of Brian, in that he was kind of depicted as a chain smoker. He was a bit of a borderline alcoholic, but in reality, you know, that he wasn't in those droves of his alcoholism until the forest years. In fact, actually, I think The Damned United, the film, makes a lot of decent choices in how it kind of skews the truth, because I got a sense that you get a lot more feeling of Clough as the man. When you think about it, the first time you see Clough, he's driving to Leeds with his two sons in the back, Simon and Nigel, and in the last scene he's kind of saying to him, you know, do you think your old man is a fool after storming out? So I don't mind the narrative choices the film makes, because I think it really does capture the spirit of what Clough is like. Particularly, you mentioned there, "Provided You Don't Kiss Me," which is, for me, is still the definitive take of Clough's genius and his downfall as a manager as well. But there are some inaccuracies in it. I mean, for example, when Derby went to play the European Cup, they say Leeds was the game that they played the fixture before. Remember when Clough, they said his ego got in the way and he put out his strongest team in practically a dead rubber league match, and that cost him the European Cup tie. That didn't happen. It was actually a quarter-final against Spartak Trnava. So you can get tied up in these sort of inaccuracies. But I think in terms of the film captures a theme of Clough's ego and his skill, kind of the ego and the drive conflicting against each other, and also the obsession with Leeds. I mean, also, if you're looking at it from a pure history point, the FA Cup fixture, you know, the famous woman Clough thinks Don Revie snubbed him after he spent a week in preparation at the baseball ground. That fixture actually took place at Ellen Road. But in terms of the story that the film itself is trying to tell, I think Peter Morgan, the writer, made some quite clever decisions, because you can get bogged down in the inaccuracies. But as you mentioned, I wouldn't hold that against it when you've got the performances so good. And it does capture what I think was the spirit of Clough.
Yeah, and the film was directed by Tom Hooper, and I think he does a phenomenal job throughout. But I just want to touch on the opening sort of 20 minutes of this film, where we see Clough with his two sons, as you mentioned, Paul, driving towards Ellen Road, and you have the situation where he arrives at the ground and he waves to the Leeds players looking down from the training ground, and there's an icy feel about it. But I want to focus in on the board meeting and the choice that Tom Hooper made to have a bright window coming in on one side of the shot. So you see Clough right down the middle of his face. One side is in complete darkness and one side is completely bright. And I think this is purposely done to show that there are two sides to this man. And we see that throughout the film. We see the vulnerable side of Clough very early doors in the next scene, where we go to a Brian Clough who's in charge of Derby County at the second division, and he loves Don Revie. And then later on in the film we see him be completely arrogant. He is obsessed with ambition and Don Revie and beating Don Revie and being the best manager that there is. And throughout his career, it may not be an obsession with Don Revie as is portrayed in this film, but we do see a real drive and ambition that was not seen at that stage from a British manager, Colm Boohig.
Well, yeah, and it hasn't been seen since, really. I mean, you can't overstate Brian Clough's achievements. Like, Derby had never won the First Division when he won the First Division with Derby. Nottingham Forest never won the First Division when he won it with them. And then to win back-to-back European Cups with two really unfancied sides. Like, he was a charisma machine, Brian Clough, and you couldn't look away. But the big question that remains over Clough is, was he nothing without Peter Taylor? And everything he achieved, every amazing feat that he accomplished throughout his managerial career was with Peter Taylor side by side. So really you're looking at the man and the human Brian Clough is the most fascinating element of him. Peter Taylor's is his knowledge of the game and his ability to spot a player, and combined to made this great team. So, I would question Clough's direct influence on the actual football side of things, and it was just because he was such a unique character, and especially for that time as well, that this was at a period of, generally speaking, in the UK and Ireland at that time, is that, men were repressed with their feelings and emotions, and they had to be hard. And with Clough, you saw him display all kinds of emotion. He was very typical of his time too. By all accounts, he was a bit of a bully, and he was a hard man, and he had absolutely no sympathy for a player if they were injured. They were cast aside completely. I would imagine if any player or staff member was going through any mental problems or emotional problems, that Clough would have no sympathy. But at the same time, he was all about players expressing themselves and playing with a smile on their face and getting the best out of individuals. And in many ways, he was like a box office version of what Alex Ferguson became, because Ferguson had an amazing ability to build great people around him and have his coaches do the work. And Fergie would know what to say and when to say it. There was a bit of that with Clough too. Clough could have done anything in his life at all, and he would have probably still made the back pages and front pages in some capacity because of what he would have gone on to do. I mean, with the film itself, I have so many questions about it. Like, I really enjoy it, but I mean, was Clough really 5 days late for his first day at Leeds? Did he really not have the ability to watch Derby play Leeds in the First Division, and did he have to go and watch it from his office because he just couldn't bear to be in the sidelines?
Well, actually, I'll butt in there. The two of those things, John Giles, who does a lot of work for Off the Ball in here, refuted in his book, and he also took the David Priest, and the book publishers up. He took action against them because of the historical inaccuracy. Clough never actually turned up 5 days late. He was John Giles says that he was there the whole time. He just didn't talk to them. And the Clough family and Peter Taylor as well have refuted the fact that he couldn't watch Derby County play against Leeds, that he was too nervous. That never happened as well. So that's one of the couple of points that have been made in this movie. Another point that has been made about this film, it was by BBC sports journalist Pat Murphy, who was a close ally, a close friend with Clough throughout his career. He found 17 historical inaccuracies with this film, and one of them is a key point in Clough's career, and it's a key point later on in his career, is the smoking and drinking, which is portrayed. I wouldn't say it's at the forefront of this film, but it's definitely in the ether somewhere. They definitely leave some suggestions that he was a strong drinker at this point in his career and a strong smoker as well. But Pat Murphy reckons that he didn't actually start drinking until about 10, 15 years later when he was in charge of Nottingham Forest. So that's one of the key points that should be made about this film.
Yeah, I mean, did he start drinking when Peter Taylor was gone? He wasn't working with him anymore, and he didn't know what to do. And yeah, it's interesting there's so many inaccuracies actually declared, because the film makes it out like he reneges completely on Brighton in their offer and he goes straight to Leeds. But he did a year at Brighton. Yeah. He managed in 73, 74. So it is made out as if, Brighton offer him this incredibly lucrative contract. They go straight on holiday at the club's expense. And during the holiday, he's like, actually, no, because he's approached by Leeds on holiday and he leaves Peter Taylor to it and goes straight to Leeds. But that didn't happen. He had a year at Brighton. And it didn't go that well. I mean, that was another really short spell with 33 games in charge or whatever it was. So he had two of those in a row with Brighton and Leeds. So in many ways, Nottingham Forest took a big chance on what ended up being the most successful stint, or one of the most successful stints in football history. So he's fascinating by that regard.
Yeah, I thought the way that Brighton were portrayed in this film was kind of funny as well, like almost a Florida of England down the south, full of Tories and a retirement home for the rich. Colm, or Ciaran, I'll bring you in on Colm.
Why'd you come to me after you mentioned Tories?
That was unintentional, but I'll let it happen anyway. Colm Meaney plays Don Revie in this film. Has Colm Meaney ever played anybody other than Colm Meaney?
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't think I'd ever seen Colm Meaney stand for God Save the Queen before, but there you go. There's something new. Yeah, he's does a fantastic job of portraying Revie like this kind of slightly aloof, very very masculine, kind of old school. He kind of reminds you a little bit of a sort of Second World War drill sergeant or something like this. And he's got such a close relationship with the Leeds players. It reminded me actually a little bit of when he's talking about kind of massaging the lads when he came into training. It reminded me a little bit of David O'Leary talking about nobody goes near my babies kind of thing. So he does a good job, and he's a good foil for Clough there, I think. To come back to something that you guys have kind of identified as a theme, I think it's a departure from a departure, as Paul rightly said. But I think actually, in terms of an accurate portrayal, at least from what I understand of Clough as a person, I think the film is a little bit more true to the general kind of core of the man than the book, which I think the book made him out to be this kind of maniacal, alcoholic, and he was an alcoholic. There's no two ways about that. But he was also someone who had, I think, quite a strong emotional intelligence as well. I mean, this was something that you saw in the film portrayed quite well, I thought, during the pre-match game when they're playing them in the First Division, and he kind of sits down beside John O'Hare and he kind of does the little, to recognise that he was nervous, and he's got these ways of motivating players. And I think certainly, if anything that you read about Clough, that's something that they always say. I mean, I think it was Larry Burns that said he would dive through a plate glass window to clear a header for Clough. So I mean, he really did inspire a great deal of personal confidence from the players. But yeah, Meaney was certainly a great foil for Sheen's Clough.
Yeah, and Clough remains one of the most interesting characters ever in football. When you watch him on YouTube, you can go down a wormhole of his interviews from all through the years, and just from managers of that era, all were brilliant speakers, but none had the charisma of Clough, or none had the arrogance. And this was something that, and it still is to this day, sort of stay in your place, don't get too arrogant, don't get too cocky. And Clough famously said, after they won the league title, and it's included in this film, he says, I wouldn't say that I am the best manager of the year, but I'm definitely in the top one. And this is just something that we haven't seen properly until this day. Jose Mourinho, and early Jose Mourinho, sort of had the charisma that Brian Clough had, but behind that charisma and behind the arrogance, there always seems to be something deep inside him that he does, like Ciaran says, have a bit of emotional intelligence about him, and that he does have an ability to connect with players, like, for example, Roy Keane, who got slapped in the face by Clough and still calls him the best manager that he's ever worked under. So where do we stand on Brian Clough's career?
A few things in there.
Yeah, I wouldn't look too far into that. What Roy Keane said, we wouldn't be the better manager than Ferguson these days for Roy Keane, and he only had a handful. But he... Clough did worse than slap him. Clough took him out in the dressing room, a punch to the gut when Keane didn't expect it coming. Which, you can look into that in lots of ways. That's what Clough was like. I mean, that was at the tail end of it as well. But he also, he had the foresight to spot Keane's talent when a lot of other people didn't. So he did have an eye, and he must have picked that up from Taylor himself. But for Clough, it was all about, he was obviously extremely special because he wouldn't have been able to achieve what he did at Derby and Forest without having something innate within that resonated with players of that, especially during that generation when, again, to overly generalise it, you're talking a lot of one-track minds at that time, and this is this breath of fresh air, and he could have easily, and probably was, laughed out of it a lot of the time. And the film depicts it despite his incredible success at Derby, when he took over, they were near the bottom of the second division. To win the second division with Derby, then to win the first division, a point ahead of Leeds, which is a great achievement, and to get to the European Cup semi-final. So this incredible CV, and then he goes off to Leeds, and as the movie says, you know, he was pretty much bullied by the players at Leeds because he went in bombastically in his first day of training and said, put all your trophies and everything that you ever won into the bin because you did it unfairly. And then the players completely turned to him, and he's seen suddenly like this lost boy. And deep down, he probably was incredibly insecure, but that is the other side of if you're someone that special that can resonate with people that much and have so many different layers to your personality. There probably is a deep-seated insecurity there too, because you're trying to be loads of different people at once, and he had to be like that, and that's what caused all this achievement in his career. He's a fascinating person more than anything.
Just on the insecurities, a large deal of it would have came from the fact that Clough, he was his career, he was cut extremely short by, he had a horrific knee injury. He had to retire. I think he was in his early 30s. So there was always that chip in his shoulder that here was a man who had he was quick to speak about his goal scoring record for Sunderland and England, and he was capped. He was a good player. And I think that chip never left his shoulder, that he was angry that his career as a footballer was never fulfilled. And because of the injury he got at a young age, a lot of the TV appearances you mentioned at the start were driven by, if you ever read about Clough, he was always worried about his finances for his family. And that's why he always would have agreed to do a lot of the TV work, because even though he made a good living out of football and, you know, he would never be out of work much long, he was a genius manager. He does come from that very northern working class, you know, look after your family values, which he even kind of, when he was signing players, that was one of the things he always said. He would like the look of the man as much as he liked the look of the player. And it kind of goes back to the point that was made earlier that he would make people feel 20 foot tall. So that insecurity was always there. But also, and so there was an element of playing up to the camera as well, because he had the ego, he had the chip on the shoulder. But also, this is a time in the 70s when TV is starting to, you know, become more popular, get into everyone's homes. In the film, you see that famous Ali clip, you know, where he goes, I'm over here in Indonesia hearing about some soccer player named Clough, which at the time I think was that he was doing punditry on a match, but in the film you see him with his family at home. So that's, for me, what I think the film gets really well. It picks and chooses the quotes that we come to define the arrogance, but it does have the little insecurities. I found, looking at the film, there was small moments, like when Luton beat them, which is portrayed in the film. It didn't happen in real life. Luton got a draw down the road his last game, but the player slammed the door on his face. Like small moments like that, or when him and Peter Taylor have their big blowout in Mallorca, there's a shot when he's kind of humming and hawing about whether to walk to Taylor to kind of make amends, but he stutters and checks himself because the ego gets in the way, because he knows what the right thing to do is. So little things like that I found captured the spirit of Clough. The ego was always there, but I think the film does well because it contradicts him in those dark moments. You know, we see him calling Don Revie on the phone, and even the conversations with Longson, the chairman at Derby, who I think Jim Broadbent played really well. I was struck again and watching again just how much of an asshole Sheen makes Clough in those scenes. I don't have a degree of sympathy for him when they accepted his decision. Okay, obviously there was some inaccuracies. They portrayed that Dave Mackay led a players' revolt. That wasn't true. He was at Forest, I think he was manager at the time. I think Mackay was one of the players that sued the filmmakers, not the book writers, the filmmakers won. But it does capture, as Colm says, those inherent contradictions that make the man.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a great point about his playing ability. And again, Michael Sheen does an absolutely phenomenal job in this film, down to the footballing ability of being able to flick the ball over. I don't know if that was actually Michael Sheen doing it, but
yeah, he can play.
Well, out of all the films that we've spoken about so far, football is actually, the way the football is played in this film is actually probably the most accurate of them all so far. I just do, before we take a quick break, Ciaran, I know you're a big fan, and Paul mentioned it in briefing there, of the Leeds first meeting with the team, where Clough's going around the team saying you and you and you and you're all dirty B words, and you can get out and you can throw your medals down the bin, you aren't worth it. And then he turns to John Giles, who is played by Peter MacDonald in this film. Peter MacDonald's way too tall to play John Giles in this film. I'm just going to put that out there first of all. And he's not good looking enough either, because John Giles was an absolutely breathtakingly handsome man when he was playing for Leeds. But that's a phenomenal scene, and the way that he just chooses to say Irishman instead of using Giles' name throughout the film, it was a nice touch from the writers of this film. But that was a brilliant scene. First of all, Ciaran.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I've always said to Nathan, actually, he should call Giles Irishman when he speaks to him on a Thursday night, but he's never heeded that, unfortunately. Yeah, it's really good, and I mean, it really just shows the level of cojones, I suppose, if you want to call it, that Clough had going in. I don't know, again, how kind of accurate that is, but I'm sure he would have been making the point very early on that they didn't play the way that Clough felt that they should. And I just come back to one of Paul's points that he made about the money situation, that Hamilton says again and again in his book that it was the money that he got paid off from Leeds that effectively allowed him to go to Forest, because that gave him the financial security that he had never had, and throughout his life, and particularly during his football career. So I think it's quite interesting when you look at it as a kind of jumping off point as to whether Clough would have had anywhere near the success that he did ultimately do without the disastrous spell at Leeds, because it allowed him the ability to kind of go down the table a little bit and take more of a provincial club to the top of the game. But yeah, I mean, it would have been an absolute nightmare of a Leeds side to try and manage. I mean, they obviously say from the outset that they wanted Giles to be manager, and then you've got Billy Bremner and Gordon McQueen and Peter Lorimer and Norman Hunter. I mean, these were absolute, killers on the football pitch. So it was a star-crossed love from the beginning, but one that was very enjoyable to watch from the outside.
Yeah, it's hard to know where we sit on this Leeds team, or where I sit in this Leeds team, because just listening to John Giles speak about it, and when Norman Hunter passed away a few weeks ago, about the relationship that they had, and if you look back at this Leeds team, every single one of them were there for about 12, 13, 14 years and beyond that, as well as Don Revie being there for 12, 13 years as well. So it's no wonder that he saw them as his sons, because he literally watched these guys grow up from a young age, coming in as apprentices to proper grown-up men. And it's hard to see. It's hard to feel sorry for Clough when he comes in with this arrogance, and he's obviously coming in from the outset without knowing the relationships in that Leeds team and how strong they actually are. He probably thought they were just rumours. So Giles himself said in the documentary The Football Man he did about a year and a half ago, he said that that actually happened, that Clough came in, had that meeting, said, Norman Hunter, you're a dirty bastard, John Giles, you're this, you're that, and that they can all throw their medals in the bin because they won unfairly. And he said that from that moment on, the team weren't with him. He didn't get off first base, was what Giles said. So obviously that was the key point in his Leeds career, and that's where it didn't really get going at all. And Billy Bremner does a great job in this film, or the actor who plays Billy Bremner, Stephen Graham, does a great job in portraying just the fact that the players just never wanted him here, and that he insulted them straight away when he came in, so he was never going to get off first base. We will take a quick short break there. Coming up after the break, we'll touch a little bit more on Don Revie and again on Brian Clough. All right, welcome back to Team 33. Enda Coll here with you for the next half hour. So I'm joined on the line by Colm, Boohig, Ciaran Bradley and Paul Moore, because we are talking about The Damned United, a film about Leeds United and Brian Clough, and that really just bad period of Clough's career. I want to touch a little bit on Don Revie before we go back to Brian Clough, because Don Revie's a man that's almost forgotten for his success in England, and because his England career didn't really turn out the way that people expected it to, he's one of these managers that probably doesn't get the respect that he deserves. Like, if you think about great British managers, you think Brian Clough, you think Alex Ferguson, you think Jock Stein, and beyond that with the Liverpool managers as well of the great 70s team, but you never really think Don Revie. Is that fair, Paul?
Yeah, I think you can kind of lump in the likes of your Bill Nicholsons of Spurs in that group. I think the way it's portrayed, I think Meany was excellent in this, because you always get the figure almost that he's left, but he's still this haunting spectre that hangs over Clough, that nothing quite right is that he's just always ominously there, hanging in the background. I do think that it is interesting. I think it's almost as if the reputation of Leeds is taken away from his from his actual managerial skill. I mean, you'll ask any manager who's won a Premier League, it's not an easy thing to do. You know, I was struck by Colm Keane someone said you won a league easily, and said there's nothing easy that comes winning a league. And even something like that, it's almost a dichotomy. Clough says he was a war man in that famous interview with Yorkshire Television. I mean, Revie himself, you don't get players to play for you with that degree of loyalty without having some degree of empathy and warmth and man management skills, which Clough is renowned for. It's what he's been famous for. You know, Martin, you see like the likes of John Robertson, Martin O'Neill still talk about him in these reverential tones. I mean, there is a danger of looking at this kind of like and portraying Don Revie as the enemy almost, and you're looking at it through you know, Clough tinted glasses, whereas the reality of it has to be a bit more nuanced as well, you know. If you ever watch how the film recreates that Yorkshire Television interview in comparison to the real thing, I mean, Revie does conduct himself quite well. He doesn't rise to the fact Clough calls him. He calls him Revie at the beginning. You know, he almost puts some manners on him. So I do think there's some distinctions you have to be drawn here as well. That it can't just be read as a Clough hagiography. You know.
Yeah, I suppose one technique that the film uses is just a classic technique of television and film and writing, is just there has to be a David for there to be a Goliath, and Don Revie is portrayed as the Goliath and Clough is definitely the David. And people will forget that Don Revie actually he did the exact same thing that Clough did with Derby County. He took Leeds from the second division straight up to the first division, and they won the league the following year. So it wasn't as if Leeds were this institution before Don Revie. He made them this institution that is portrayed in the film. And I suppose you are coming into the end of his Leeds career where Leeds are the giants of England and he is the best manager in England. So that's probably why they don't show his success. Or I felt he was a little bit hard done by in this film, in the sense of they really portrayed him as a ghost-like figure who just the Leeds fans loved him, the players still loved him, and he just hung over Clough's career there. I'm not really sure how historically accurate that is. I do want to touch on that interview because that is one of the best interviews of all time. It's one of the best TV appearances of all time. It's one of the best things, in my opinion, that's ever happened in English football. It boggles belief how they managed to get two managers that clearly did not like each other onto TV together to sit down and do that interview. It's well worth the 25 odd minutes, but they're very selective in what they choose to leave in and take out of this, because you obviously you miss out on. I was kind of disappointed that you missed out on the whole I want to win the league but I want to win it better situation. So you're Clough wants to get across it. He wants to play football the way it should be playing, and Don Revie didn't play it the way Clough believed he didn't play it. But in this, they do make a fatal error, because I don't think throughout that entire real life interview Clough refers to Don Revie by his first name. In this film he does, and that was a real point in that Clough made in that interview, that he didn't refer to Don as Don, he referred to him as Revie, because he felt he was disrespected the entire time because people referred to him as Clough as opposed to Mr. Revie or Mr. Clough by the players. Firstly, the film's portrayal of this interview, Ciaran, what did you make of it?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good, all told. I mean, like you, I'm a fan of the kind of the verbal jousting that went on. I think you're right in that. So whenever I was watching it struck me that it was almost like Clough was playing chess and Revie playing drafts. Like it was a little bit of a strange one. Like when Clough says, I want to win the league, but I want to win it better, and he's like, oh well, we only lost 4 games. He's like, oh well, we can only lose 3. It's like that. That's so blatantly obvious, and I think in that way it was a strange one, because I kind of felt like he was a little bit of, slightly dim-witted in that respect, but that would be immensely unfair on Revie.
The sheer disrespect as well in that one point, Ciaran.
It really it captured that little sparkle that Clough had in his eyes. And I think where Clough was maybe ahead of the curve, albeit it goes somewhat for Shankly as well, it is recognising the power of a one-liner and the power of the media at that point. And the media, less to be said, the media was a lot more concentrated at that point. I mean, there were only 3 or 4 television channels, so if you were on the match on one side and then you were on local TV on other, like you're laughing. So no, it was really Clough at his best, and Meany I think really gets down the mannerisms, because Revy's kind of like, he's always like this, kind of like looking at the floor intensely, concentrating on what's happening. But I thought it was a cracking scene for sure.
Yeah, they got some finer details really good in this, down to the suit colours that they were wearing and the way that Revy was wearing his hair, and Colm Meany, the way he sat back in his seat with his legs crossed. Was the mannerisms and the way that they act in this was absolutely spot on to what the actual interview. The key point that you made there is how concentrated the media was at this stage. This happened on local TV. This was Yorkshire television. This wasn't Sky Sports. This wasn't BBC. This was a local TV show getting the former Leeds United manager and the current England manager on together at the one time. It just wouldn't happen nowadays. In modern terms, what managers would this have been on this TV? Would it be Mourinho, Wenger? Would it be Wenger, Alex Ferguson, Pep Guardiola, Mourinho? Like, what is this in modern day sense? What 2 managers could you see actually taking this interview on and being as feisty as they were?
Klopp and Mourinho would come to mind. I'd say chalk and cheese. Klopp has the kind of his philosophy to football, attack, beautiful game, all that stuff. Mourinho, the arch pragmatist, the cartoon villain. That's probably the first one that springs to mind with me. Also, just on that scene, again, when you compare and contrast the film to the actual interview itself, it does a decent job. I think a lot of credit has to go to Peter Morgan again. Like, I think that's the Damn United's the 5th time I think Sheen worked with him in his career. Like, he wrote Rush, so Rush and Frost Nixon. Ironically, actually, one of Clough's interviews after that one was with David Frost himself. So Sheen went from playing David Frost and Frost Nixon to playing Clough in the Damn United. But he has a real knack for kind of understanding sporting mentalities, particularly if you look at something as Rush with the Nicky Lauda James Hunt rivalry. He really does get kind of the ambition and the ego and the self-destructive pattern, I guess, of what drives some of the best people in the sporting world. So I think Morgan did a fantastic job in the script. But yeah, I'd be more than interested in seeing the Damn United for Klopp versus Mourinho, maybe part 2 or follow up in the modern era.
I was almost interrupting Ciaran when he was speaking there about just the various things that Clough says in that interview, and it's amazing that how Colm Meany, how Don Revie is able to restrain himself from getting so boiled up angry in that interview. I mean, the arrogance of him saying, I want to win the league and I want to win it better, but he follows that up with, you can't understand that, can't you? Good lad. Like, he's talking to the England manager at that stage. So it amazes me that this interview happened. Colm, what's your memories of watching that interview? Well, the first time you watched that, could you believe it was actually 2 real England manager and Leeds manager?
Oh, it was fantastic work by the producer, whoever was on duty that day, to get them both and to sneakily get them both too, by all accounts. What amazed me more was that Clough did the interview with Yorkshire Television the day he got the Leeds job. If that's true or not, I'm not sure. And then the Leeds board being furious with him for doing that. So he was a law unto himself. I mean, this was a self-employed guy, really, who happened to be almost like a managing consultant with all these various clubs. He seemed to answer to nobody but himself. Saying to Revy, like, you do understand that, don't you? I mean, that's Clough's own insecurities as well. Because, what we learn in the movie is that he's in awe of Don Revy at the start. And that probably never goes away to a certain extent. So when he's saying, you can understand that, can't you? He's probably saying that to himself more than anybody. And I mean, you have to think as well, he's just been sacked by Leeds after 44 days, having followed that with a 1-season spell with 3rd Division Brighton, which is very underwhelming. His confidence was at an all-time low, and yet he comes out with this. I mean, and the closest thing you do see to that in modern day is Jose Mourinho, who You know, it's never Jose's fault, and that helps him. That helps him big time. I mean, you know, there's actually are comparisons between the two, because Mourinho did wonders at Porto, brilliant stuff at Chelsea, incredible stuff with Inter. So he does all that and he goes to Real Madrid. But the players have no respect for him because he never played football to any real degree.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Colm, because that's Mourinho's vulnerability right there. Straight away, his insecurity is that he never played football at the highest level. And the players will always hold that against him. And I think he's trying to really hammer home the fact that he knows about football regardless.
Well, who makes the best managers? Just think about that. You know, there are very, very few who have great careers. Pep Guardiola and Johan Cruyff probably stand out. But as Paul already touched on, you know, Clough's playing career, and he was a very good player, was completely unfulfilled, as was Alex Ferguson's. You know, these guys carry chips on their shoulders. They're never happy. When Manchester United won the Champions League in 2008, at the celebration dinner that night, Fergie was already thinking about who they're going to bring in next. What players can they bring in to improve the squad? You know, these people don't rest. And Clough, as much as he publicised his achievements and probably embellished them to an extent, was probably never satisfied. And I would say it broke Clough's heart that in the 80s and early 90s, he didn't achieve an awful lot with Nottingham Forest. They won the League Cup in 89 and 90. They lost the League Cup final in 92 to United. And then his last season of football, they got relegated from the first season in the Premier League. And Martin Tyler interviewed Clough in the final day of the season of 92-93. And Clough, in a kind of defeated manner and tone, said, we're just not good enough. And there was a pause, and then he leaves. So you know, if you stay around long enough, that's what happens. That's why Fergie went out when he did, and that's when David Moyes came in, and Moyes did what Clough did at Leeds, and it was just never going to work. And with the Revie and Clough comparisons, like, Revie's only successful job in management was Leeds, because it's incredible, because it was over 13 years, and he won everything, with the exception of the European Cup, which Clough pointed out. But then he was an unmitigated disaster with England, and then he went off to the UAE, managed the national team, and then two other sides as well, and, you know, faded into the distance. Both men faded into the distance in the end. And that's what's really fascinating about looking back on it. And the first thing I did when I saw the movie again recently was, obviously one of the last scenes in the film is the two of them with that Yorkshire Television interview. And then I went on YouTube and watched the real interview. And the real interview is so much more nuanced than the film one, because Clough is visibly hurt in the real one. Yeah. And there's a lot of concession in his body language. And even what he's saying. He knows he did wrong. You know, he's not coming across like he does in the film, where we're still on his side. We're still on Clough's side. I mean, all Brian Clough had to do with Leeds was continue on what they were doing with Revie and just slightly changed over a while. But his own ego and insecurity took over, and he was like, no, I have to change this immediately. He's never going to.
I think that's a good point. And one of the things that I was trying to get across earlier on was, if you watch any of Clough's real life interviews, if you just look at his eyes, there is a real deep side to this man that you can't see at face value, because he hides it with his arrogance. And in that interview with Revie as well, it looks like he's genuinely hurt by the fact that this man never really accepted him as an equal to him, because that's really what he always wanted to be. He always wanted to be accepted as one of the best managers in England. And even when he achieved the success with Derby, Don Revie still doesn't really seem to give him the respect that he thinks he deserves. But ultimately, that comes down to the fact that Clough had insulted Revie and insulted what Revie had achieved as well. So there's a couple of sides to it. We're running slightly out of time here, but I just want to get your thoughts on the film itself and where it ranks. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has 92%. On IMDb, it's 7.5 stars out of 10. Leaving aside the historical inaccuracies to the film, I thought this was a brilliant film overall. The directing's fantastic. The cast are all brilliant throughout the film. And the storyline runs pretty well. It has all the classic cliches off a great novel. So, Ciaran, what are you giving this film out of 10 or out of 100 or out of 5? Whatever way you want to rank it.
Yeah, I'd give it a 7. I'm kind of strangely not ambivalent about this film, but like I really want, when I first saw it sort of 7 or 8 years ago, I really, really wanted it to be better than it was. And that sounds like I'm slagging it. I'm not. I still really enjoyed it, and I particularly enjoyed Sheen's characterization of it. I thought Meany was very well cast. I liked Timothy Spall as Taylor. I don't know why it leaves me a little cold around it. I like it. Again, that's to sort of probably overegg the pudding a little bit, but no, I thought it was good. Like it's really nicely shot. There's a nice kind of British film feel to it. Like what I mean by that is if you look at the lights, the kind of full Monty and stuff like that, there's a bit of grayscale to it, so it kind of puts across the slightly grim aspects of 70s Leeds and 70s Derby. But yeah, 7 for me. I really enjoyed it. The aspect of Sheen's characterization and the supporting cast were very good as well.
Paul?
Yeah, I remember watching it as well in the cinema, thinking it's right up there, and having watched it down the years, yeah, I'd still rate it as my favourite football film, I think. I kind of get what was mentioned before. I think it's because everyone has their own favourite era of Clough. Personally, you could do a book on Provided You Don't Kiss Me, if anyone hasn't read it, Duncan Hamilton's book, which is a brilliant tale of Clough in the happier years when he was at Forest, and then his downfall, which Colm mentioned previously. So I think it's you could do a trilogy of Clough. I mean, there's so many different eras you could do. A 10-part documentary series would be fantastic, The Last Dance-esque. But no, I think it all comes down to Sheen just anchors the film so well. I mean, from the accents to the mannerism, when he pushes his tongue up between his teeth, even the small things like that. And leaving the film, you mentioned there the interview, there's genuine pain in his eyes, and even the small moments when he asks his kids, has your dad been foolish? He captures that contradiction, which we all love so much of Clough, of the ego, but also the insecurities, of the wild temper, but also the lovable family man. The burning ambition to take over this massive project, which he knew was beyond them, with the skill of taking a club like Derby into the European Cup. I mean, he's extraordinary in it. And the supporting cast as well, as we mentioned previously, are excellent. And I kind of like the fact that it doesn't focus an awful lot about the drama on the pitch, because nothing will ever top the drama which is happening with Brian Clough. So I think it makes some clever choices to not focus as much on the actual kind of the cliched and the step overs and the trappings that Hollywood can fall into when it makes sort of football films. As was rightly said, this is a film, I think, made by people that understand football and, more importantly, understand the mentality of Brian Clough.
Star out of 80 or
yeah, solid 4 out of 5 for me, 80%.
80%. I think that's the highest rating any film has gotten so far in our 3 weeks of this film reviews. I completely agree with both of you on many points. Ciaran, I think the grayscale British feel to this film adds a lot to it. I also do agree that it does leave you feeling slightly cold. I felt like I went on a deep dive on Clough on YouTube, the real Clough and the real interviews after this, and it left me feeling more satisfied than watching this film did. But again, I think as a film itself, as a standalone film, Michael Sheen is excellent in it. The supporting cast are really good. Colm Meaney's brilliant as himself. Timothy Spall, I was slightly distracted as with him playing Pete Taylor, because I can't get away from the fact that he plays a Harry Potter character. I will always see him as the guy from Harry Potter. So that's one downside from this film for me. Colm, I'll leave the last word to you. Your thoughts on Clough overall, because I know you haven't seen this film in a while.
I'll go out of 100 first in the rating. I'll go 100. I'll go 77 out of 100, right? Which kind of falls in line with what Ciaran was saying. I have a similar enough opinion about it to Ciaran. Thought the performances were absolutely outstanding. I actually thought Timothy Spall was the MVP for the film. His depiction of Peter Taylor is fantastic, because you sympathise with him so much and you believe him. Michael Sheen was just on a hot streak at that point in his career around Frost Nixon and Tony Blair as well, when he played Tony Blair. Just unbelievable at getting into the character of someone. As Paul said there, the tongue up to the teeth and just the mannerisms are perfect, and the tone and the way he carries himself. Not to mention Colm Meaney. But sounds like I'm getting emotional. I'm just getting choked up. But I thought I think it's a really good. It's an easy watch. I can watch it again and again. There's nothing great about the film. There's no one scene that I really look back on with fantastic memories of, and for that reason I watch repeatedly. Whereas the movies that I really do love, like we described with Mike Bassett, there are scenes that I go back on repeatedly and watch. And with Damned United, I don't have any, but I find it a very easy watch, and I find it a very solid 7.5 out of 10 for that reason. I think the performances individually are better than the movie collectively.
That's a fair point. I'm going to round you down to 7.5 or 75 because of OCD reasons. We cannot have a 77% on Team 33 for our ratings. I would say with my 7.5 as well, that probably leaves the film in around 7.5 as a rating, which I think might be the highest we've rated a film so far, or it's at least on par with Mike Bassett. But that is all we have time for on Team 33 this week. My thanks to Colm, my thanks to Ciaran, and to Palmer as well. Thanks, lads. We will chat to you